On a humid afternoon in June 2004, in the small city of Valdosta, Georgia. The kind of day where the heat rose in waves off the asphalt, where children begged their parents for trips to the municipal pool, where men in work shirts counted the hours until quitting time. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in almost every way. But before that day ended, someone in Valdosta would be dead. And 15 years would pass before anyone understood why. The answer, when it finally came, would arrive not through science or technology, but through something far more fragile. Something that had been there all along, waiting in silence. Before we continue with this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe. We cover cases like this one, cases where time buries the truth, but never quite deep enough. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We'd love to know how far these stories reach. His name was Marcus Webb, and on that June afternoon in 2004, he was 41 years old. To the people who knew him in Valdosta, Marcus was a familiar presence in a town where most faces were familiar. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at one of the industrial facilities on the south side of town, the kind of job that kept the bills paid but didn't leave much room for luxury. He'd grown up in South Georgia, spent most of his adult life within 50 miles of where he was born. Marcus wasn't married. He'd been close once, people said, back in his 20s, but it hadn't worked out. He lived alone in a small rental house on Troop Street, a modest neighborhood where the houses sat close together and everyone knew when you came home late. He kept to himself mostly, but not in a way that made people uncomfortable. He'd wave from his front porch. Stop to talk if you caught him at the right moment. He was the kind of person you might see at the grocery store and exchange pleasantries with, then not think about again until the next time. Those who worked with him described Marcus as reliable. Quiet, but not withdrawn. He showed up on time, did his job without complaint, helped out when things went wrong. He didn't socialize much with his co-workers outside of work, but that wasn't unusual. Plenty of men kept their work life and personal life separate. The facility where Marcus worked had been part of Valdosta's industrial landscape for decades. It manufactured components for agricultural equipment, parts that would end up in tractors and harvesters used across the South. The work was steady, the pay decent by local standards. Marcus had been there for nearly 8 years by 2004, long enough that people knew his routines, his habits, the way he liked his coffee in the break room. There was one part of Marcus's life, though, that he kept more than separate. He kept it hidden. Marcus had learned early that there were parts of yourself you didn't share in a place like Valdosta. Not because people were necessarily cruel, but because certain truths made people uncomfortable. Made them ask questions you didn't want to answer. Made your life more complicated than it needed to be. So Marcus had become skilled at presenting a version of himself that was acceptable, unremarkable, safe. He attended church occasionally, though not every Sunday. He helped his elderly mother with yard work when she needed it. He fixed things for neighbors who asked. He existed in the space between visible and invisible, present but not prominent. It was a careful balance, one he'd maintained for years. On the evening of June 15, 2004, Marcus didn't come home from work. His supervisor at the facility noticed first. Marcus had left around 5:30, same as always, but he'd mentioned he had an errand to run. Nothing unusual about that. But when Marcus didn't show up for his shift the next morning, people started to wonder. Marcus was never late. In 8 years, he'd maybe called in sick 3 times. His reliability was one of the things people appreciated about him. So when his time card sat unpunched that Wednesday morning, his supervisor made a call to his house. No answer. Left a message. Tried again an hour later. Still nothing. By that afternoon, a coworker who lived near Marcus drove by his house. His truck wasn't there. The lights were off. No sign of him. The coworker called the supervisor, who suggested waiting another day. Maybe Marcus had a family emergency, something that had pulled him away suddenly. It happened. But by Thursday, when Marcus still hadn't shown up, hadn't called, hadn't responded to messages, people were genuinely worried. The supervisor contacted the sheriff's department, filed a missing person report. Described Marcus, gave them his vehicle information, his home address. It was the day after that when someone found Marcus's body. A county road maintenance crew was working along a stretch of rural highway about 12 miles outside Valdosta, clearing brush from the drainage ditches that ran alongside the road. It was hot work, the kind that made men stop frequently for water, made them wish they'd chosen different careers. The highway they were working on was State Route 94, a two-lane road that connected Valdosta to smaller communities to the west. It wasn't heavily traveled, especially not at night. One of the crew members, a man named Earl Jackson who'd worked for the county for 15 years, stepped into the ditch to pull away a tangle of vegetation and debris that had accumulated after recent rains. The ditch was about 4 feet deep, muddy at the bottom. Earl grabbed a branch, pulled, and that's when he saw it. At first, he thought it was clothing. A jacket maybe, or a tarp someone had dumped. But then he saw the shape beneath the clothing, the way it lay in the water. Earl dropped the branch and scrambled back up to the road. "Call 911, he told his crew chief. "There's a body down there." Marcus Webb was lying face down in the shallow water and mud at the bottom of the ditch. He was fully clothed, wearing the same work pants and shirt he'd left the facility in 2 days earlier. His boots were still on his feet. His wallet was in his back pocket. He'd been there, in that ditch, for at least 36 hours. The Lowndes County Sheriff's Department arrived within the hour. Deputies cordoned off the area with yellow tape, began documenting the scene. The medical examiner was called. Photographs were taken. The ditch, the road, the surrounding area, all of it was processed with the careful attention that violent death demands. Marcus's truck was found later that morning, abandoned in a gravel pull-off about a quarter mile down the road, keys still in the ignition. There was no sign of a struggle inside the vehicle. No blood, no obvious evidence of violence. Just Marcus's truck, sitting empty, as if he'd simply pulled over and walked away. By late afternoon, the medical examiner had arrived to examine the body before it was transported to the morgue. By evening, the word had spread through Valdosta the way bad news always spreads in small towns, quickly, quietly, with a kind of stunned disbelief. Marcus Webb was dead. And the way he died left no room for easy answers. The preliminary findings from the medical examiner came back within 48 hours. Marcus had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The injuries were severe, multiple impacts, concentrated on the left side of his skull and face. The kind of injuries that suggested violence, intention, rage even. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a man who'd lost control of his vehicle and struck his head in a crash. The medical examiner noted defensive wounds on Marcus's forearms, bruising, abrasions. He'd raised his arms to protect himself. He'd seen it coming, at least partially. He'd tried to fight back, or at least tried to shield himself from the blows. There was something else the examiner noted in the report. Marcus's body showed signs of having been moved after death. Lividity patterns, the way blood settles in a body after the heart stops, indicated that Marcus had been lying on his back for several hours after he died, then had been moved to the face-down position in which he was found. This meant Marcus had been killed somewhere else, left for a time, then transported to the drainage ditch. The investigation that followed moved with the urgency that homicides always command. Detective Harold Simmons, a veteran investigator who'd worked cases in Lowndes County for over 20 years, was assigned as lead. Simmons was methodical, patient, the kind of detective who believed most cases were solved through consistent, unglamorous work rather than brilliant insights. He began with Marcus's last known movements. Marcus had clocked out of work at 5:28 on Tuesday, June 15. Security footage from the facility's parking lot showed him getting into his truck at 5:32, alone. He'd driven out of the parking lot heading south, toward town. Simmons and his team interviewed Marcus's co-workers, his neighbors, the few friends he maintained contact with. They wanted to know about Marcus's habits, his relationships, any conflicts he might have had. They wanted to know if he'd seemed worried about anything in the days before his death, if he'd mentioned meeting anyone, if anything had been unusual. The picture that emerged was of a man whose life appeared unremarkable. Marcus paid his bills on time. He had no criminal record beyond a speeding ticket from years earlier. He didn't owe anyone money. He wasn't involved in drugs, didn't gamble, didn't get into fights at bars. His co-workers described him as dependable, friendly in a reserved way. His neighbors said he kept to himself but was always polite. Simmons examined Marcus's truck thoroughly. The vehicle was processed for fingerprints, blood, hair, fibers, anything that might point toward who had been with him last. They found Marcus's fingerprints, naturally. But they also found partial prints on the passenger door handle that didn't match Marcus. The prints were smudged, incomplete. Not enough for identification through the database, but enough to suggest someone else had been in the vehicle. They found Marcus's wallet in the truck, cash still inside, about $40. His cell phone was there too, an older flip model common in 2004. The call log showed nothing unusual, a few calls to coworkers over the past week, a call to a local auto parts store the previous Saturday, a call to his mother on Sunday evening. Robbery didn't appear to be the motive. Simmons turned his attention to the location where Marcus had been found. State Route 94 wasn't a road Marcus would have taken for any normal errand. It led away from town, toward rural areas where the houses were far apart and the businesses were sparse. If Marcus had been heading somewhere specific on that route, Simmons needed to know where. He and his team canvassed the area. They knocked on doors at every house within 2 miles of the crime scene. Had anyone seen Marcus's truck on Tuesday evening? Had anyone noticed vehicles pulled over in that area? Had anyone heard anything unusual that night? Most people had seen nothing. The highway wasn't heavily traveled after dark. A few residents mentioned seeing vehicles pass by. You noticed headlights when you lived on a dark rural road, but no one could say for certain they'd seen Marcus's truck. One elderly woman thought she might have heard something around 11 or midnight. Maybe a car door slamming. Maybe voices. But she'd been watching television with the volume up, and it was dark. She hadn't looked outside. Simmons checked for businesses in the area that might have security cameras. There was a gas station about 3 miles east, closer to town. The owner provided footage from Tuesday evening. At 6:14, Marcus's truck appeared on camera, pulling up to one of the pumps. Marcus got out, filled the tank, went inside to pay. He was alone. The attendant working that evening remembered him vaguely, just another customer, nothing unusual about the interaction. The footage showed Marcus leaving the station at 6:21, heading west on State Route 94. Away from town. Toward the area where he'd be found dead. That was the last confirmed sighting of Marcus alive. Simmons spent long hours trying to understand what had happened in those missing hours. Marcus had filled his tank at 6:21. His body had been discovered Thursday morning, and the medical examiner estimated he'd been dead for at least 36 hours, which meant he'd died sometime Tuesday night or very early Wednesday morning. So where had Marcus gone after leaving that gas station? Who had he been meeting? The sheriff's department held a press conference 4 days after Marcus's body was discovered. Simmons stood before the local news cameras, the South Georgia heat making everyone uncomfortable in their formal clothes, and asked the public for help. If anyone had seen Marcus on the evening of June 15, if anyone knew where he might have been going, if anyone had information about who he'd been spending time with, the department needed to hear from them. The tip line rang steadily for the next week. People called with observations, theories, suspicions. A few calls seemed promising at first. Several people confirmed seeing Marcus at the gas station that evening. One caller thought she'd seen a truck matching Marcus's description parked at a rest area about 5 miles west of town, but she couldn't be certain of the day or time. Another caller, a man who'd been driving home from work late Tuesday night, thought he'd seen 2 vehicles pulled over on State Route 94, somewhere around the area where Marcus's body would later be found. But it had been dark, he'd only noticed them in his headlights for a moment as he passed, and he couldn't describe them beyond maybe a truck and a car. Simmons followed every lead he could. He interviewed the gas station attendant again, asking for any detail he might have overlooked. Had Marcus seemed nervous? Had anyone been waiting in the truck? Had Marcus said anything unusual? The attendant remembered nothing helpful. It had been a normal transaction with a customer he'd never seen before and would never see again. The team checked Marcus's financial records. His bank account showed no unusual activity. No large withdrawals. No deposits. His credit card, he only had one, showed standard purchases. Groceries. Gas. A payment to the electric company. Nothing that suggested he was involved in anything that might have gotten him killed. They pulled phone records for every number that had called Marcus in the month before his death. Most numbers were easily explained: co-workers, his mother, a mechanic he'd used a few months earlier. But there was one number that appeared 3 times in the week leading up to June 15th. The calls were brief, just a few minutes each. Simmons traced the number. It belonged to a prepaid cell phone, purchased with cash at a convenience store in Valdosta. The phone had been activated on June 7th, had made only those 3 calls to Marcus, and had gone inactive on June 17th, 2 days after Marcus's death. This was significant. Someone had contacted Marcus using an untraceable phone. Someone who didn't want their identity connected to Marcus. Simmons requested any available surveillance footage from the convenience store where the phone had been purchased, but the store's system only kept footage for 30 days. By the time Simmons made the request, the footage from early June had been overwritten. Another dead end. By late summer, the investigation had slowed considerably. Simmons and his team had conducted over 60 interviews. They'd processed every piece of physical evidence from the crime scene. They'd followed up on every credible tip. But they had no suspect, no clear motive, no witnesses to the actual crime. The case hadn't gone cold yet, not officially. Simmons was still working it actively. But the momentum had stalled. Without new evidence or new witnesses, there was nowhere left to go. Marcus's funeral was held on a humid Saturday morning in early July at Grace Baptist Church, a small white building on the north side of Valdosta. The church could seat maybe 100 people. About 50 came to Marcus's service. His mother, Dorothy Webb, sat in the front pew, supported on either side by relatives who'd driven in from Macon and Albany. Dorothy was 73 years old, frail, her hands shaking as she clutched a tissue throughout the service. Marcus had been her only child. His father had died when Marcus was young. Dorothy had raised him alone, worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, sacrificed in all the ways mothers do. Now she was burying him, and she didn't understand why. The pastor spoke about Marcus in the gentle, generic terms that pastors use when they don't know the deceased well. A good man. A hard worker. Someone who kept his troubles to himself, who didn't complain, who helped when help was needed. The congregation nodded. It was all true, as far as it went. What the pastor didn't say, what he didn't know to say, was that Marcus had lived much of his life in a kind of careful isolation. That he'd learned to present a version of himself that was acceptable while keeping his real self hidden. That he'd spent years longing for connection but believing that real connection was too dangerous to pursue. After the service, people stood in small groups in the church parking lot, talking quietly. They wondered who could have done such a thing. They speculated about motives. Some thought it must have been random, wrong place, wrong time. Others thought Marcus must have known his killer, must have trusted them enough to meet them in that isolated location. No one guessed the truth. Dorothy moved in with relatives in another county shortly after the funeral. She couldn't stay in Valdosta. Everywhere she looked, she saw Marcus. The grocery store where they'd shopped together. The diner where they'd had breakfast sometimes on Sundays. The street corners where she might glimpse someone who looked like him from behind, just for a moment, before the illusion broke. She took Marcus's belongings with her, his clothes, his photographs, the modest collection of possessions that represented a life. She kept them in boxes in her new bedroom, couldn't bring herself to go through them yet. Couldn't decide what to keep and what to let go. The house on Troop Street sat empty for several months. Marcus's landlord eventually cleaned it out, repainted, found new tenants. Life continued in that methodical way it has of moving forward whether you're ready or not. At the sheriff's department, Simmons kept working the case when he had time, but other investigations demanded attention. There were domestic violence calls, drug cases, thefts, assaults. A small department with limited resources couldn't afford to have a detective working a single case indefinitely when that case had no active leads. By the fall of 2004, Marcus Webb's murder had effectively gone cold. The file remained open. Every few months, Simmons would pull it out, review the evidence, see if anything new jumped out at him. Sometimes a case would solve itself this way: you'd look at the same facts for the 100th time and suddenly see them differently. But with Marcus's case, nothing new emerged. Simmons retired in 2008. He'd spent 26 years with the department, worked dozens of homicides, seen things he wished he could forget. On his last day, he met with the detective who'd be taking over his open cases. They spent an afternoon going through files. When they got to Marcus Webb's case, Simmons spent extra time on it. "This one bothered me," Simmons said. "Good man, no enemies anyone could identify, killed by someone he probably knew. The prepaid phone suggests premeditation or at least paranoia. But we never figured out who bought it. Never identified who he was meeting." The younger detective promised to give it attention when he could. Simmons nodded, but he knew how it worked. New cases would take priority. Old cases, especially unsolved ones with no active leads, would stay in their files gathering dust. Years passed. The name Marcus Webb stopped appearing in local news. The anniversary of his death came and went each June without notice. The people who'd known him moved on with their lives, though some thought of him occasionally, when they drove past the industrial facility where he'd worked, or when they saw someone who reminded them of him, or in those quiet moments when unresolved questions rise up unbidden. Dorothy Webb lived with the questions every day. She'd wake in the morning and for a moment forget that Marcus was gone. Then memory would return, heavy and sharp. She'd attend church with her relatives, listen to sermons about God's plan and faith through suffering, and wonder why God's plan had included her son being beaten to death and left in a ditch. She'd call the sheriff's department once a year, usually around the anniversary of Marcus's death. Just checking if there were any updates. Any new leads. Anything at all. The answer was always the same. "No, ma'am. We're sorry. The case is still open. If anything changes, we'll let you know." By 2010, Dorothy had mostly stopped asking. Not because she'd accepted it, but because hope had become too painful to maintain. In the fall of 2017, more than 13 years after Marcus Webb's murder, something shifted in the investigation. Not because new evidence had appeared, but because someone decided to look at old evidence with fresh eyes. Detective Carla Hutchins had joined the Lowndes County Sheriff's Department in 2015. She was 32 years old, a Georgia native who'd worked patrol for several years before making detective. She had a reputation for thoroughness, for refusing to accept easy answers when the evidence suggested complications beneath the surface. The sheriff, looking to clear some of the department's older cold cases, had assigned Hutchins to review several unsolved homicides from the early 2000s. The goal wasn't necessarily to solve them, though that would be ideal, but to see if modern investigative techniques or technologies might offer new angles. Hutchins was given access to 5 cold case files. Marcus Webb's was one of them. She started reading on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The file was thick, hundreds of pages of reports, witness statements, crime scene photographs, evidence logs. Hutchins took her time. She read everything twice, made notes, highlighted inconsistencies or questions that seemed unanswered. The case fascinated her for several reasons. First, Marcus appeared to have been a genuinely low-risk victim. He wasn't involved in criminal activity. He didn't have dangerous associates. He lived quietly, worked steadily, kept to himself. People who commit murder usually have some connection to their victim: family, friends, business partners, lovers. But Marcus's social circle appeared extremely limited, and no one in it seemed capable of violence. Second, the location where Marcus's body was found suggested planning. He'd driven to a remote area, met someone there. This wasn't a random encounter. Marcus had gone there intentionally, which meant he'd agreed to meet whoever killed him. Third, the prepaid phone. That detail suggested whoever Marcus was meeting didn't want their identity traced. Which suggested they had something to hide. Hutchins spent weeks reviewing the file. She read through every witness statement, looking for details that might have been overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant in 2004. She studied the crime scene photographs, trying to understand the sequence of events. She reviewed the physical evidence, the tire iron that had been recovered near the scene but hadn't yielded useful fingerprints, the partial prints from Marcus's truck, the fibers collected from his clothing. One detail kept catching her attention. Several witnesses in the original investigation had mentioned that Marcus seemed to be going somewhere specific the night he died. He'd told his supervisor he had an errand. He'd filled up his truck with gas, a full tank, which suggested he might have been planning to drive somewhere beyond his usual routine. But no one had ever determined where he'd been headed. Hutchins decided to start there. She began reaching out to people who'd been interviewed in 2004, asking if they'd be willing to talk again. Many had moved away. Some had died. Others simply didn't want to revisit something from so long ago. But Hutchins was persistent. She tracked down former co-workers of Marcus who'd scattered across Georgia and beyond. She found neighbors who'd moved but were still reachable. She located distant relatives who might have information about Marcus's life that hadn't been explored in the original investigation. Most of the conversations went nowhere. 13 years was a long time. Memories faded. People couldn't remember details that might have been clear in 2004. But in late December 2017, Hutchins spoke with a woman named Patricia Hollis. Patricia had worked at the same facility as Marcus back in 2004, though in a different department. She'd been interviewed briefly during the original investigation but hadn't had much to offer. She barely knew Marcus. When Hutchins called her, Patricia was retired, living in a mobile home park outside Valdosta. She agreed to talk, though she wasn't sure she'd be helpful. "I didn't really know Marcus well," Patricia said over the phone. "We'd see each other in the break room sometimes, say hello. That was about it." Hutchins asked if Patricia remembered anything about Marcus's personal life, who he'd been friends with, who he'd talked to. Patricia thought for a moment. "Actually, now that you mention it, there was someone Marcus used to talk to sometimes. A younger guy. I can't remember his name, but I'd see them having lunch together every now and then. It always seemed a little odd to me because Marcus usually kept to himself. He wasn't much for socializing." "Can you describe this person?" "He was maybe in his late 20s. Tall, 6 foot or taller. I think he worked in the shipping department, but I'm not positive. I'm sorry, I just can't remember his name." It wasn't much. But it was something the original investigation might not have explored fully. Hutchins went back through the interview records from 2004. Several of Marcus's co-workers had been questioned, but the focus had been on people who knew Marcus well, people who might have had conflicts with him. A casual work acquaintance wouldn't have seemed significant at the time. Hutchins began the painstaking work of tracking down former employees who'd worked in the shipping department in 2004. The facility's human resources department was willing to help, but their records from that era were incomplete. Some files had been lost in a computer system migration. Others existed only on paper, stored in boxes in a warehouse. It took Hutchins nearly a month to compile a list of names. Then came the harder part, finding these people. Some had stayed in the area. Others had moved to Atlanta, Florida, Tennessee. A few had died. One was in prison for an unrelated crime. Hutchins worked through the list systematically. She called, sent emails, even showed up at people's doors when they were local. Most of the conversations were brief. People remembered working at the facility but didn't remember Marcus specifically. Then, in late January 2018, Hutchins reached a man named Trevor Calloway. Trevor was living in Atlanta now, working in logistics for a distribution company. He'd left the facility in 2006, moved away to start fresh. When Hutchins explained why she was calling, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Marcus Webb," Trevor finally said. "Yeah, I remember him. We'd eat lunch together sometimes. Not all the time, but every couple weeks maybe. Can you tell me what you remember about him?" "He was a nice guy. Real quiet, but friendly once you got him talking. He liked to read. I remember he always had a paperback in his truck. We'd talk about books sometimes, or sports. Nothing too deep. Did you notice anything unusual about Marcus in the weeks before his death? Another pause. Longer this time. Actually, Trevor said slowly, there was something. About a week or two before it happened, Marcus mentioned he was going to meet someone. He didn't say who, but he seemed kind of nervous about it. I remember because it was unusual for him to talk about his personal life at all. Hutchins felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice calm. Did he give you any details? Where he was meeting this person? Why? No. I asked if everything was okay, and he kind of brushed it off. Said it was just something he needed to take care of. I got the impression it was important, but he didn't want to talk about it. Did he seem afraid? Not afraid exactly. More like, anxious. Like when you have to have a difficult conversation with someone and you're dreading it. Hutchins thanked Trevor and ended the call. Then she sat at her desk for a long time, thinking. Marcus had been nervous about meeting someone in the days before he died. That suggested the meeting had something to do with his death. But who? And what had been important enough to make Marcus nervous? She went back to the physical evidence. Marcus's cell phone records from 2004 had been preserved in the file. Hutchins studied them again, this time looking for any calls in the 2 weeks before his death that might have been significant. Most of the numbers were easily explained: co-workers, his mother, a local mechanic, the auto parts store. But there was that prepaid phone number. 3 calls in the week leading up to June 15th. Each call lasting just a few minutes. In 2004, detectives had traced the number to a prepaid phone purchased with cash at a convenience store. No name attached. The phone had gone inactive shortly after Marcus's death and had never been used again. Back in 2004, that dead end had seemed like just another frustrating aspect of a frustrating case. But now, with Trevor's information, it took on new significance. Someone had been in contact with Marcus using an untraceable phone. Someone had arranged something with him, something that made Marcus nervous. And shortly after those calls, Marcus was dead. Hutchins knew she needed to find out who'd bought that phone, who'd made those calls. She started by re-examining the convenience store where the phone had been purchased. The store was still in business, a small place on the south side of town that sold groceries, beer, and prepaid phones. Hutchins visited, talked to the current manager. The manager had only been working there since 2010. He knew nothing about a phone purchase from 2004. The store had changed ownership twice since then. Records from that era? Long gone. Hutchins asked about surveillance footage. The manager laughed, not unkindly, just at the absurdity of the question. They kept footage for maybe 2 weeks now. Back in 2004. If they'd even had cameras, which he wasn't sure about, the footage would have been taped over within days. Another dead end. But Hutchins wasn't ready to give up. She began looking at Marcus's life from a different angle. If someone had gone to the trouble of using an untraceable phone to contact Marcus, it suggested premeditation. It suggested whoever killed Marcus had been planning it, or at least had anticipated the need for secrecy. What had Marcus been involved in that would require that level of caution? Hutchins went back to the people who'd known Marcus best. She spoke with his cousins, tracked down the few friends he'd maintained contact with over the years. She asked about his relationships, his habits, anything he might have kept private. Most people had little to offer. Marcus had been a private person, yes, but not suspiciously so. He'd lived a simple life. He'd worked, came home, kept to himself. If he'd had secrets, he'd kept them well. But one of his cousins, a woman named Denise who lived in Macon, mentioned something that hadn't appeared in the original investigation file. Hutchins drove to Macon to meet Denise in person. They sat in a Waffle House booth on a cold February afternoon, coffee steaming between them. Marcus was lonely, Denise said. That's what I remember most about him. He'd come to family gatherings and he'd seem happy to be there, but there was this sadness underneath. Like he was always a little bit apart from everyone else. Did he date? Have relationships? Denise nodded. He dated some over the years. But nothing ever seemed to work out. I remember my mom, his aunt, used to worry about him. Thought he was too isolated. Did he ever talk to you about anyone he was interested in? Anyone he was seeing around the time he died? Denise stirred her coffee, considering. Actually, yes. He called me about a month before he died. It was unusual because we didn't talk on the phone much, mostly just saw each other at holidays. But he called, and he seemed happy. Said he'd met someone. I asked who, but he didn't want to give me details. Said it was early and he didn't want to jinx it. Did he say anything else about this person? Just that it felt different this time. That's the phrase he used, it feels different. I asked him what he meant, but he kind of laughed it off. Said he'd tell me more when he knew where it was going. And you never found out who it was? No. I didn't even remember that conversation until after he died. And then when I did remember, I figured maybe whoever it was had nothing to do with what happened. The police were looking for someone who'd robbed him, or some random violent crime. I didn't think his dating life mattered. Hutchins drove back to Valdosta thinking about what Denise had said. Marcus had met someone. Someone who made him happy. Someone he'd been reluctant to talk about, even to family. She returned to the evidence from the crime scene. The defensive wounds on Marcus's arms. The blunt force trauma to his head. The location where his body had been found, isolated, rural, the kind of place you'd go if you didn't want to be seen. This wasn't a random attack. This was personal. Hutchins began working through a theory. What if Marcus had been involved with someone romantically, and something had gone wrong? What if that person had contacted Marcus using the prepaid phone to arrange a meeting? What if Marcus had driven to that rural area expecting one thing, and found something else? It was speculation, but it fit the evidence better than the random violence theory that had dominated the investigation in 2004. The challenge was identifying who Marcus had been seeing. But if Marcus had kept that relationship secret even from family, how could Hutchins uncover it 14 years later? She spent weeks pursuing different angles. She reviewed Marcus's credit card statements again, looking for charges that might indicate where he'd been going, who he'd been with. She found receipts from restaurants, but they were all modest places, the kind where you'd eat alone just as easily as with someone else. No pattern emerged. She looked at Marcus's small circle of friends, wondering if any of them might have been more than friends. But the few people Marcus had stayed in contact with were clearly just acquaintances, people he'd known from work or church, people he'd exchanged pleasantries with but not confide in. Hutchins was beginning to feel the case slipping away again when something unexpected happened. In early March 2019, she received a phone call at the sheriff's department. The caller was a man who identified himself only as someone who'd lived in Valdosta in the early 2000s. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances, he wouldn't say who, that a detective was asking questions about Marcus Webb. He wanted to talk, but he was nervous. Hutchins asked if they could meet in person. The man hesitated, then agreed. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Valdosta the following day. Right now, as this story unfolds, what time is it where you're listening from? The coffee shop was busy when Hutchins arrived, mid-morning rush, people grabbing drinks before work or settling in with laptops. She'd chosen a table in the back corner, somewhere with a little privacy. The man who approached her table was in his early 50s, graying hair, glasses, wearing a button-down shirt and khakis. He looked like someone who worked in an office, managed accounts or sold insurance. His handshake was firm but his hands were shaking slightly. "I'm Stephen Garrett," he said, sitting down. "Thank you for meeting me." Hutchins ordered them both coffee, gave Stephen time to settle himself. She could see he was struggling with something, trying to find the words to begin. "I don't know if what I have to tell you will help," Stephen finally said. "But I've thought about Marcus Webb for 15 years. I've thought about whether I should have said something back then. I told myself it wasn't relevant. That it was private. That it wouldn't matter. But I was wrong." Hutchins waited, letting him work through it at his own pace. "Marcus and I were friends," Stephen continued. "Not close friends, but we knew each other. We met through a support group. 4 gay men. It was very informal, very quiet. Just a few guys who'd meet at someone's house once a month. This was South Georgia in the early 2000s. Most of us weren't out. We just needed somewhere we could talk to people who understood. This was new information that hadn't appeared anywhere in the original investigation. Hutchins kept her expression neutral, professional. Go on. Marcus was one of the quieter members of the group. He'd listen more than he'd talk. But he was there regularly. He was figuring things out, I think. Coming to terms with who he was in a place that wasn't always accepting. Why didn't you come forward in 2004? Stephen looked down at his coffee cup. Because I was terrified. The support group was secret. We all protected each other's privacy. It was an unspoken rule, we didn't acknowledge each other in public unless the other person acknowledged us first. We didn't talk about the group to anyone outside it. And I was married at the time. To a woman. My wife didn't know. Nobody knew. If I'd come forward, I would have had to explain how I knew Marcus, why I knew things about his personal life. I couldn't do that. I told myself it wouldn't help anyway. That Marcus being gay wasn't relevant to who killed him. But you think differently now. I've thought about it every day for 15 years. And yes. I think whoever Marcus was seeing killed him. Hutchins leaned forward slightly. He was seeing someone. In the weeks before he died, yes. He didn't tell the group who it was, but he seemed happy about it. Nervous, but happy. Then one week, this would have been maybe a week or 10 days before he died, he came to the group and he was different. Worried. Upset. He said the person he'd been seeing was having second thoughts. Said the person was afraid of being outed, afraid of what people would think. Did Marcus mention a name? Any identifying details? Stephen shook his head. Never. But he said something that stuck with me. He said the person worked in a position where being outed would ruin them. That's the phrase Marcus used, ruin them. I got the impression it was someone with a family. Someone with a reputation to protect. Someone who had more to lose than Marcus did. What do you think happened? I think the person panicked. I think they couldn't handle the risk of Marcus being in their life. And I think they killed him to keep him quiet. Hutchins asked Stephen if he'd be willing to give a formal statement, to have this conversation on the record. Stephen hesitated, then nodded. He'd come this far. He couldn't turn back now. Over the next hour, Stephen told Hutchins everything he remembered about the support group, about Marcus's involvement, about the relationship Marcus had mentioned. He gave her the names of other group members who might remember something useful, though he warned that most of them had moved away or were still closeted. After Stephen left, Hutchins sat in the coffee shop for a long time, processing what she'd learned. This changed everything. The original investigation hadn't explored this aspect of Marcus's life because no one had known about it. Marcus had been closeted, careful, protecting not just himself but the person he'd been involved with. And that person had killed him. Hutchins returned to the sheriff's department and began working through the implications. She looked at the evidence from the crime scene with new understanding. The prepaid phone made sense now. Someone who was closeted, who had something to hide, would use an untraceable phone. The isolated location made sense, somewhere they could meet without being seen. Marcus's willingness to drive there made sense, he'd been expecting to meet someone he trusted, someone he cared about. She thought about what Stephen had said. The person worked in a position where being outed would ruin them. In 2004, in South Georgia, that could have meant many things. A teacher. A minister. A government employee. A business owner. Law enforcement. Anyone in a position of public trust where being gay, particularly being closeted and deceptive about it, could destroy their career and reputation. Hutchins began compiling a list. She looked at men who'd held such positions in Valdosta in 2004. She focused on those who'd been in their 30s to 50s, the age range that seemed most likely given Marcus's age and the dynamic Stephen had described. The list was long at first. Hutchins included anyone who met the basic criteria: position of authority, right age range, living in or near Valdosta in 2004. Then she began the process of elimination. Some names she could rule out quickly. Men who'd died before Marcus. Men who'd moved away years earlier. Men who had alibis for the night of June 15, 2004. She went back through the old case files, checking who'd been interviewed and what they'd said. Other names remained on the list, possibilities without proof. Hutchins ran the names through the system, looking for anything that might connect them to Marcus. Shared addresses at any point. Shared employers. Traffic citations issued in the same location on the same day. Credit card purchases at the same business. Anything that might suggest their paths had crossed. She found nothing conclusive. Which wasn't surprising. If Marcus and his killer had been meeting secretly, they would have been careful about leaving traces. Hutchins tried a different approach. She contacted the other support group members Stephen had named. Most didn't want to talk. Coming forward meant revealing something they'd kept hidden for years, and not everyone was ready for that. A few had died. One was willing to talk but remembered nothing useful about Marcus's relationship. The investigation was moving forward, but slowly. Hutchins felt like she was getting closer to something, but she couldn't quite see it yet. Then, in early July 2019, something broke open. A man named Dennis Pritchard walked into the Lowndes County Sheriff's Department and asked to speak with a detective. The desk sergeant asked what it was regarding. Pritchard said he needed to talk about Marcus Webb. The sergeant called Hutchins. She came down to the lobby, met Pritchard, showed him to an interview room. Pritchard was in his late 50s, graying at the temples, wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt. He looked like he hadn't slept well in a long time. "I need to talk to you about Marcus Webb," Pritchard said after they sat down. Hutchins turned on the recording equipment, stated the date and time, identified herself and Pritchard. "Go ahead. I've been following the investigation. I know you've been asking questions again. I know you've been looking into Marcus's personal life." Pritchard paused, his hands trembling slightly. "I was the person he was seeing." The room went very quiet. Hutchins felt her pulse quicken but forced herself to stay calm, professional. "Tell me what happened." Pritchard took a breath, then began. "I was married in 2004. I had 2 kids, they were teenagers then. I was a vice principal at one of the high schools in town. I'd been in education for 20 years. I was also gay, and I'd never told anyone. Not my wife. Not my kids. Nobody." "How did you meet Marcus?" "Through someone we both knew. I won't say who, I don't want to out anyone else who was in the group. But we met, and we started talking, and then we started seeing each other. Very quietly. Very carefully. We'd meet at his house sometimes, or drive out to places where no one would see us. It went on for a few months." "What happened in June 2004? Pritchard's voice was steady but his eyes were red. "In early June, my wife started asking questions. Where was I going in the evenings? Why was I distracted? She didn't suspect I was seeing a man, she thought maybe I was having an affair with a woman. But she was asking questions, and I panicked. I told Marcus we needed to stop seeing each other. He was upset, but he said he understood. I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't. No. Marcus called me a few days later. He said we needed to talk in person. He said he couldn't just walk away, that he needed closure. He needed to understand why I was ending things. I agreed to meet him." "You used a prepaid phone?" Pritchard nodded. "I bought it with cash. I was paranoid about anyone seeing calls between us on my regular phone records. My wife had access to those records. If she'd seen repeated calls to the same number, she would have asked questions." "Where did you agree to meet?" "I suggested that stretch of highway out past town. State Route 94. It was isolated, somewhere we could talk without being seen." Marcus agreed. "He drove out there, I drove out there. We met around 9 or 9:30 that night. Walk me through what happened." Pritchard closed his eyes for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. When we met, Marcus wasn't angry. He was just sad. He told me he understood I had responsibilities, a family, a career. But he said he deserved honesty. Deserved to be treated like he mattered. He said he'd spent his whole life being careful, being invisible, and he was tired of it. Tired of protecting men who were ashamed of themselves. What did you say? I got defensive. I told him he was being selfish, that he didn't understand what I was risking. We argued. And then Marcus said something that terrified me. He said he might tell people about us. Not to hurt me, he said, but because he was tired of hiding. Tired of living in fear. He said maybe the truth needed to come out. For Dorothy Webb, Marcus's mother, the sentencing brought a complicated kind of closure. She was 88 years old by then, her health failing. She'd lived 15 years not knowing who killed her son or why. Now she knew. Her son had been killed by someone he'd trusted. Someone he'd cared for. Someone who'd valued his own comfort over Marcus's life. Dorothy attended the sentencing in a wheelchair, her relatives supporting her on either side. When given the chance to address the court, she spoke briefly. My son was a good man, she said, her voice shaking. He didn't deserve to die that way. He didn't deserve to be thrown away like he was nothing. I'm grateful for Detective Hutchins, for not giving up. I'm grateful Mr. Pritchard finally told the truth, even though it took him 15 years. I hope he thinks about Marcus every day he's in prison. I hope he understands what he took from this world. She died 6 months later, in the summer of 2020. Her relatives said she'd seemed more at peace after the sentencing. As if she'd been waiting all those years for permission to rest. The resolution of Marcus Webb's case sent ripples through Valdosta and through the broader community of people who'd known Marcus or been part of that quiet support group in the early 2000s. Stephen Garrett, who'd finally found the courage to come forward, told a reporter that he hoped Marcus's death might mean something. That maybe it would remind people of the cost of secrecy, of the violence that shame and fear could breed. He said the support group had existed because men like him and Marcus didn't feel safe being themselves. And that lack of safety had ultimately cost Marcus his life. The high school where Pritchard had worked released a statement expressing sympathy for Marcus's family. They noted that Pritchard had resigned in 2012 for personal reasons. They didn't elaborate on those reasons, but people could read between the lines. The weight of guilt had made it impossible for Pritchard to continue in a role where he was supposed to guide and mentor young people. For Detective Carla Hutchins, the case had been a lesson in assumptions. The original investigation in 2004 had been thorough in many ways, but it had operated within certain assumptions about Marcus's life. They'd looked for obvious motives: robbery, revenge, business disputes. They'd seen Marcus as a straight, working-class man whose murder must have stemmed from something visible, something that left clear evidence. They hadn't considered that the motive might be buried in a part of Marcus's life he'd kept deliberately hidden. And they hadn't considered it because in 2004, in South Georgia, asking about a victim's sexuality wasn't standard practice. It was seen as private, possibly irrelevant, maybe even invasive. But Marcus's sexuality had been deeply relevant. It had shaped his relationships, his sense of safety, his willingness to trust. And ultimately, it had gotten him killed, not because being gay made him vulnerable to random violence, but because being involved with someone who was closeted and terrified made him vulnerable to that specific person's fear. The case also revealed something about confession. Dennis Pritchard hadn't come forward because DNA evidence had identified him. He hadn't been caught because a witness came forward or because security footage surfaced. He'd confessed because he couldn't carry the secret anymore. Because Hutchins's renewed investigation had made him realize the truth was coming, and perhaps because 15 years of living with what he'd done had worn him down to the point where confession offered the only path to relief. There's something profoundly human about that. Guilt accumulates over time. Silence becomes its own kind of prison. Pritchard had walked away from that drainage ditch in June 2004 believing he'd protected himself, preserved his life. But what he'd actually done was sentenced himself to 15 years of waiting. Waiting for the knock on the door. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. Waiting for the moment when the lie would finally collapse. The Lowndes County Sheriff's Department updated its protocols after the case. They added questions about victims' personal lives, including sexual orientation and relationships, to their standard interview guidelines for homicide investigations. They trained detectives to approach such questions with sensitivity but to understand their potential relevance. It seemed obvious in retrospect. But in 2004, it hadn't been obvious. And that gap in understanding had allowed Marcus's killer to walk free for 15 years. Hutchins closed the case file in 2020, after Pritchard's sentencing. She made a note for any investigator who might review it in the future: ask about what isn't said. Look for what's been hidden. The truth doesn't always announce itself. Those words apply beyond Marcus's case. They apply to the dozens of cold cases still sitting in file rooms across Georgia and across the country. Cases where the evidence exists but hasn't been understood correctly. Cases where witnesses exist but haven't been asked the right questions. Cases where the solution is waiting, just beneath the surface, for someone to look at it from a different angle. Marcus Webb was 41 years old when he died. He worked hard. He paid his bills. He tried to build a life that made sense to him in a place that didn't always make room for people like him. He'd spent years being careful, being invisible, protecting not just himself but the people he cared about. And in the end, one of those people killed him for it. There's a bench now in one of Valdosta's small parks, placed there by a group of Marcus's former co-workers. It has a simple plaque, in memory of Marcus Webb, 1963 to 2004. He deserved better. People sit on that bench without knowing the story behind it. Children play nearby. Life continues, the way it always does, with the past present but not always visible. The case files on Dennis Pritchard's conviction note that he will be eligible for parole in 2035, when he's in his 70s. Whether he'll be granted parole remains to be seen. Whether he's genuinely remorseful or simply exhausted by the consequences of his actions is a question only he can answer honestly. In interviews after his sentencing, Pritchard said he thought about Marcus every day. He said he'd destroyed 2 lives that night, Marcus's and his own. He said if he could go back, he'd make different choices. He'd be honest about who he was. He'd accept the consequences of that honesty rather than resorting to violence. But he couldn't go back. None of us can. The past remains fixed, immutable, a weight we carry forward whether we want to or not. The people who stayed with this story until the very end are exactly the ones this channel exists for. You already understand why these stories matter. They matter because Marcus Webb mattered. Because every unsolved case represents a person who deserved better. Because time doesn't erase the truth, it just tests our commitment to finding it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and share this with someone you know who values stories like this. This case forces us to sit with uncomfortable questions. How many other cold cases remain unsolved not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because we haven't understood the lives of the victims well enough to know what we're looking at? How many files contain the answers, waiting for someone to read them with fresh eyes and fewer assumptions? Marcus's story matters not just because of how it ended, but because of what it reveals about the cost of silence. About the violence that fear can breed. About the way shame, both personal and societal, can create conditions where people feel trapped between being themselves and staying safe. In the 15 years between Marcus's death and Pritchard's confession, the world changed in some ways. Attitudes about sexuality shifted, at least in some places. Legal protections expanded. More people felt safe living openly. But in other ways, particularly in small communities, in places where reputation still matters deeply, where families and careers can be destroyed by revelation, in those places, not as much had changed as we might hope. And people are still dying because of it. Marcus Webb's murder wasn't a hate crime in the traditional sense. Pritchard didn't kill Marcus because he hated gay people. He killed Marcus because he hated the part of himself that Marcus represented. Because he was so terrified of his own truth that he chose murder over honesty. That distinction matters. It tells us something about where violence comes from, about the internal battles that can escalate into external harm. It reminds us that the most dangerous people aren't always the ones who hate us, but sometimes the ones who are wrestling with the same truths we are and can't accept them. Detective Carla Hutchins continued working cold cases after Marcus's case closed. She's solved several more since 2019. In an interview with a local paper, she said the work teaches you humility. That you learn how much you don't know, how much you assume, how easily the truth can hide in plain sight if you're not looking for it in the right way. She said Marcus's case taught her to question every assumption. To ask not just what the evidence shows, but what the evidence might be hiding. To understand that people's lives are more complex than they appear on the surface, and that complexity matters when you're trying to understand how they died. Years from now, when someone reviews this case file, they'll see a story of persistence. Of a detective who refused to accept that a case was unsolvable just because it had been unsolved for 15 years. Of a witness who finally found the courage to come forward despite the personal cost. Of a killer whose conscience wouldn't allow him to keep living a lie. But more than that, they'll see a story about Marcus Webb. About a man who tried to live honestly in a world that punished honesty. About someone who deserved love and safety and dignity, and got violence instead. Rest in peace, Marcus Webb. You deserved a life free from fear. You deserved to be yourself without consequence. You deserved better than to die on a summer night in 2004 because someone else was too afraid to live honestly. Your story matters. Not because of how you died, but because of how you lived, quietly, carefully, always protecting others even when it cost you everything. I'll see you in the next one.